And I take that to be something supporting this structural realist view. However, I'm not going to talk any more about all this general stuff now. I'm going to talk about quantum particles and individuality, and how all of that relates to the second kind of structuralism. So the second kind of structuralism involves the idea that the entities in the domain are mutually dependent on each other for their existence, for their individuation. There are different ways of thinking about it. Mathematical structuralism is a case in point. Arguably, it makes no sense to talk about the number 3 independently of the other numbers, or to talk about the numbers without the number 3. Now, that's not an uncontroversial claim. I keep quoting him, and he's really tough as well, he might do me, but Graham Priest, when he came to give a talk in Bristol, was quite convinced that it made perfect sense to talk about God creating all the integers but leaving out 3. But I think, no, that makes no sense whatsoever. Right? To be 3 is just to be the successor of 2, and to have 4 as your successor, and so on. Numbers are individuated structurally by the relations to other numbers, and you can argue this goes more generally for mathematical objects. So how should we characterise structuralism? There are different things that people say. They talk about the objects being incomplete in some way. So there's the idea numbers are incomplete because they only have structural properties. There's the idea of dependence, and you might be talking about, well, you see, the number 3 is ontologically dependent on all the other numbers. And then somebody says, what do you mean by ontologically dependent? And you say, well, you know, it's the in virtue of relation, right? So there's work to be done, I think, in sort of seeing whether we can turn this idea of ontological dependence or the in virtue of relation into make it precise. And then another way of thinking about it is to think in terms of individuation, and this term contextual individuation was introduced by John Stachel. And then it's an interesting question to ask how these are related. So more generally then we can ask further questions. Just in general in philosophical logic, what are criteria of identity and what kinds of conditions should we impose on them? Should criteria of identity be predicative? And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And should we require some form of identity of indiscernibles? What is individuation anyway? Do we need a substantive account of that? Does it even make sense? How can we analyse dependence? And then, what are the relations between notions like entity, object, individual? And I don't think this is, I mean, it's not very clear. Often people will talk about whether or not something is or other is an object without being clear what they have in mind, as opposed to being something that we talk about, because there's a logically thin notion of object, which is just the value of a first order variable, or something we quantify over. And then there are thicker notions, like the notion of an individual. You might think, oh right, individuals are more than objects because individuals persist over time, you might think. Right? Or you might think there are commitments to views about trans-world identity for individuals, but not for objects, or whatever. Okay, now many people object to structuralism in the second sense, along the lines that Russell objected to data code. And there's this argument that says everything's got to be grounded in individuals with intrinsic properties. You can't have, so famous phrase, relations presuppose numerical diversity and therefore cannot account for it. Right? So the thought is that you can't appeal to relations among objects unless there is, in some sense, already objects there. Relations can't obtain without objects already being there. So, here's Russell, you know, there has to be some class of entities having a genuine nature of their own. Right? So each object's got to have its own nature before it can get into relations with other things. That's the claim. And this is one of the main things I want to talk about, really, is about the idea of relational individuation. Okay, so people, by the way, when I said impredicative then, so just to remind you, definition is said to be impredicative if it involves quantifying over the totality that includes the individual that you're trying to give criteria of identity for, or give a definition of. Sometimes people say that's the problem in Russell's paradox. Abstraction principles are usually impredicative, and you might just think, but why there should be a problem if you're talking about epistemology? That is, if you're talking about picking out or defining or giving criteria of identity for things, who cares if I refer to the totality? I'm not bringing them into existence by already appealing to the totality. I'm just characterising them in terms of the totality. Okay, so the link between mathematical structuralism, structuralism in general, and quantum mechanics is that there's an objection to mathematical structuralism based on the principle of identity of indiscernibles. And the idea is something like this. If you think that mathematical objects' identity is exhausted by their relations to other objects, then you're committed to two objects that stand in all the same relations to everything else as being the same object. But there are mathematical cases of objects that violate that, so therefore structuralism can't be right. So the argument is structuralism implies PII, there are mathematical objects that violate PII, therefore not structuralism. And the most well-known example is that of I and minus I. Notice if anyone says I is the square root of minus 1, then you have to say, which one? It's one of the square roots of minus 1. It's not possible, using the language of complex analysis, to say something about I that isn't true of minus I. There's a non-trivial automorphism of the complex plane that involves reflecting it through the real axis. Not true with the reals. With the reals, it's really minus 1 is really different to plus 1. And you can see that just by thinking about the asymmetry. Minus minus equals plus, but plus plus doesn't equal minus. Right? So that structure does not have this non-trivial automorphism, but the complex plane does. So this objection is made by Burgess and Karenin to Shapiro's mathematical structuralism. Okay, so now on to PII. So Leibniz, of course, thought that no two individuals could have all the same intrinsic qualitative properties. Every snowflake differs from every other, we're told. So you can think of PII as a second-order logical principle that says, for any, you can't state it in words without saying something silly, because you just say for any two things, if they have all the same properties, they're the same thing, and that doesn't make sense, right? So you have to say it in the contrapositive form. There are no two things that have all the same properties. Okay. What McTaggart called the dissimilarity of the diverse. Now, there are then questions about the scope of the quantifier there. Do we allow it to range over all properties, only intrinsic properties? And then we can ask whether we have whether it's necessarily true. So you might think about snowflakes. You might think, well, maybe it is true that no two snowflakes have exactly the same structure, right? But they could. It's just very unlikely. There's no sort of law of nature that guarantees that a snowflake that fell in the Arctic 1 million years ago and another one falling tomorrow can't be exactly the same as each other. It's just not very likely, maybe. So that would mean that we had it as a contingent truth rather than a necessary one. Okay, so PII is interesting because it's connected with individuation. That is, and I remember once years ago being at a conference and Simon Saunders, Steve French and I were going on about principles of individuation, and Simon Saunders said, what the hell is that? You know? And I said this, it's that in virtue of which a thing is itself and not anything else. And you're like, that's lovely, James, but what does it mean? And I think he's there getting at the use of the word in virtue. You know, we say these kinds of things in time. It's that in virtue of which a thing is what it is. But what is the in virtue of relation? What's that about? Now, I say, well, don't worry about that then. Just think about in deflationary terms. Just think, look, there are facts for any domain about the identity and diversity of things in it. And ask the question, what's the relationship between those facts and the facts that aren't about the identity and diversity of things? Okay. And PII is there to tell you that